Yes, good morning. The topic of this lecture will be about stakeholders, or to be more precise, stakeholders management. And the objective of this lecture is to give you an overview over this topic, and in particular, to recognize the importance of involving, defining these stakeholders, and to be able to perform the so-called stakeholders mapping in order to develop the right communication strategies based on your classification. First, let us go through some of the definitions. So what is actually a stakeholder? The Project Management Institute define a stakeholder as could be individuals, persons, or organizations who are involved in the project, and or actually has some interests, some concerns that are affected by the projects. So they have something there they are concerned about. Similarly, stakeholders could as well be people or organizations or individuals who can affect the project goals or results. So in brief, they are affected or can affect the projects. Some others give a shorter definition. It's a person or a group of persons who are affected or are able to influence the project. Young, for instance, gave it another, even more broader definition, says that stakeholders are all individuals who, in one way or another, contribute to the project success or failure. So in brief, all these definitions agree that stakeholders are important. And we have to find one way or another to involve them in the right possible way. The process of doing that is called the stakeholders management. And the stakeholders management as a part of project management is difficult because of the following. First, it's very difficult to identify all the stakeholders upfront. And if you remember in the last lecture, we talked about uncertainty. And this uncertainty makes it difficult to know who will be involved, who has interest in this project, who can influence this project, who can contribute to the success or failure of this project. In addition to that, it is really hard to predict the relationship between these stakeholders and the project. In general, we could say this particular individual is important, but how important he or she is, or a group or an organization, how important, how critical are they to the success or failure? So here, we build a lot of this stakeholders management based on assumptions. There is another factor that complicates this stakeholders management, and that opinions change, people change, context change, the perceptions of what is right and what is wrong change. People have, over the time, gets more demands, have more expectations, and therefore you can't really satisfy all stakeholders, or you can develop a static strategy to address all these differences. Therefore, stakeholders management as a tool should be much more dynamic and flexible. It changes over time in order to address all these uncertainties. The process of stakeholders management consists of 3 steps. The first step is to identify all the stakeholders. if you are able to do that. Make a list of them. And then you need to analyze how each one of them influence or is influenced by the project. And this is, again, you really need to gain a lot of information. It's a serious analysis. And here we will use a tool called stakeholder mapping. You map them, you divide them across categories, and you put them in boxes. And this is perhaps one of the challenges of this method, because once you put a stakeholder into a box, then you have actually defined how you are going to deal with this particular person, which might turn out to be wrong. And then you develop these strategies based on the location of each stakeholder in these boxes. This is a generated list of all typical stakeholders. Just to mention, one of them is the project owner. And many would suggest that the project owner is the most important stakeholder. Why? Because they have the money. They are the one with the resources. They are the one who initiate a project. And then you have financial institution, the banks. You need some sort of financing. So the project or the result of this project or the outcome of the project should be aligned with the interests of these institutions. So they influence the project. And then there is something called the line management. Line management is the functional managers in any organizations. They are actually the one who will give the resources to the project to be executed. Then they have a stake immediately. They have interest, they have concerns. So the list of typical stakeholders is actually unlimited. Anyone could be a stakeholder. Any organization or sub-organization or a unit in an institution could be a stakeholder. It's important, therefore, to have an overview of these stakeholders. And we come to this tool, stakeholders mapping tool. The objective of this tool is to position the various stakeholders. And there is a common method very much used in project management literature. And here we are not taking a stand or a critical stand about this method, but this is what the method is. This is what the people are using in their project management methods. This method is based on dividing the stakeholders into stakeholders who can influence the project. In another word, these are stakeholders that you need in order to complete your project. And there are some stakeholders that you might not need, but they have interests and concerns, they have needs. They care about this project because it will affect them or affect their future or affect their now situation. So this method is based on actually dividing each category, the one who influence the project, along a matrix. And we simply divide them into two categories. Those who have a critical influence and those who has marginal influence. The same with the stakeholders interest group. There are who have great interests, and there are some stakeholders who have few interests. Let's explain what we mean by influence and interest here. Influence is a typical type of stakeholders who has some power. Without them, you are not able to get your project right. For instance, the client or the customer or the top management in any organization, you need to get their approval. If you have a plan, then they have to approve the plan. If you have a product, then they have to approve this product. If you need some resources, they have to approve these resources. Then that means that they influence the project through their ability to approve or disapprove. That's one category of this influence. Sometimes they have great influence, sometimes they have minor influence. The authorities, if you are going to build anything, even in your own house, if you want to open a window or to close a window or to do anything, you have to get permission from the authorities. Then they influence your work. If the authorities say, no, you can't open this window or you can't add this addition, then nothing will happen to your project. Again, permissions are also a way to influence. Support, getting support from various departments in your organization in terms of resources, in terms of time, could be as well a way to show influence or to exert influence on the project. The suppliers, in order to build anything, you need suppliers. Although they will sell you, they will gain money, but they still have some influence. If they don't want to sell, or if they don't have, or if they don't prioritize your project, and they want to give you a late delivery, for instance, then your project might get delayed. So this is how influence is exerted. Influence means that something you need. Without it, you cannot go forward into the project. And these are typical influencers of your project. The interest is a little bit tricky. These interests, some of them, they could influence your project, but some of them, they have little influence on your project, but they still have some concern. A typical concern for instance, in any organization, if you are going to make any change project or any transformation, is to retain their jobs. They don't want to get fired after the digitalization initiative or the transformation initiative is completed. So they want to keep their jobs. Then they develop interest and concern about this project. And if you don't develop the right strategy, then they will exert a lot of resistance. Some others are concerned with the safety issues. I want, especially the authorities, safety during construction. You have to follow certain rules. And if you don't follow these certain rules, and at the same time, these authorities have a lot of power on you, then they might stop your project. Sometimes the organization has interest in the project in the sense that the entire organization will have a greater value as a result of completing this project. So again, there are a lot of interests. Some of them are great interests, or some stakeholders have some serious interest, and some of them has minor interest. Based on that, so you can build this matrix. It's a 2x2 matrix. In one dimension, the vertical dimension, you have the influence dimension, and then you can divide it into two categories, the critical or marginal. The same way, the interest axis, this the horizontal one. Some stakeholders have small interest, not very much, and some of them have a lot of concerns, large interest. And then you get this nice looking matrix with 4 groups. The first group is stakeholders who has critical influence, and a lot of concerns, a lot of interests. We call this is a critical group because you are dependent on them. At the same time, they have a lot of expectations. So there is some kind of relationship between their interest and influence. If you don't satisfy their interest, you will not be able to proceed because they have a lot of power on you. And then you have group 2. This is important group. Their contribution is critical, but they don't really have a lot of interest. You could think of, for instance, a supplier which has some critical delivery to your project, for instance, and at the same time, there is a lot of suppliers like that. There are many suppliers who deliver. So this supplier has a critical influence. You need their product, you need their contribution, but they know very well they don't have really a lot of concerns. They are just interested in selling you this particular product or delivery. So you could place them here. But if this supplier, there is very few of them, and their contribution is critical, then they might start exerting some demands, right? And if they start exerting some demands, then suddenly you have to move them to group 1. So again, there is no rule that which should be placed in what box, but it is their criticality and their interest that decide that. So this must be studied. And then you have this group 3. This group of people include stakeholders who they have no influence actually, or marginal, but they have a lot of expectations. For instance, if you are a developer and you are going to develop a housing compound in any area, one important stakeholders are the neighbors, are the people who are living in the near areas of this compound. They don't have direct influence on the project. You are not dependent on them, but they have some concerns about safety, about noise, about working hours. And if you don't try to address these concerns, they might start mobilizing some lobbyists, and actually they could make it difficult for you to continue with your project. So how can we address this type of people or this group? And then you have this marginal group, no interest and no serious concerns, but they can change their position. For instance, a typical stakeholders who falls in this group is the media, journalists. If you are a developer and everything goes smooth in your projects and there is no problem and there is no issues of concern, then most likely media will not have anything to say. But if the problem started to appear one way or another because of concerns of the neighbors, for instance, then this group or the media group start to talk about your project, write about it, criticize it. And then it's suddenly you have to do you must have a media strategy to handle this type of issues in the media. So my point here is everyone in these boxes can move. There is no standard rule of where you place your stakeholders. Now the strategies. So suppose that you have already classified them and you put them in the right place. So what will be your strategy? Again, project management literature suggests that there are 4 strategies because you have 4 boxes. The first group is the collaborate. this is a group who has huge interest and great influence, great power. You have to collaborate with them. You don't do things that they don't want, and you prioritize their concerns. And then the second group is the satisfy group. Not a lot of interest, but they have a lot of power. You satisfy these interests. You satisfy these concerns. You address their concerns. So this is but you don't have to take them into every single decision in your project. Make sure that you adhere to their requirements, simple as that. And then you have group 3. Again, they have a lot of concerns, but they cannot influence. One way is to inform them. Inform them about how you proceed, how you address several requirements in your projects. Make the information available to this kind of group. And if you are able to satisfy some of their concerns, then of course you do that if it is not expensive to satisfy these concerns. So if they are concerned about safety, then you might want to build a fence around the compound. If they are concerned about the working hour and the noise, it is very simple. Then you restrict the working hour on your site and inform about these working hours. So they want to be informed. They want to be told. And you have the group 4, which is the monitor group. You don't do anything in particular except keeping an eye on them. Because once, if they change their position, then they become an issue. And you have to deal with that. Last, there is one thing you can talk about, concerns and influence. But what if someone has influence, but they are not supportive to your project? So how you deal with that? You see, in any project, support is very important. You need to have support by various stakeholders, especially the internal stakeholders, support by the client, support by the project owner, support by the different line managers in your organization, support by end users. People must be willing to collaborate with you. So the scale of support can vary. You have someone who give you full support. They are your champions, right? They are absolutely your champions. They think of the project as their own cause. That's a first level. And some, they are willing to approve. They don't have this affectionate relationship to your project, but they are willing to approve. And some don't have this affectionate relationship, but they comply. Again, they don't have strong opinion regarding support. And there are some who are neutral, don't care if the project go that way or the other way. And then start the negative form of support. Some would say, no, we should go slowly. We are going too fast. And then some will exert some resistance. And then when someone say, no, that's the rejection group. And some could be very hostile, and you start sabotage to your project. It means that it is not enough to assess the degree of power. You have to assess to see the degree of support and try to develop the right strategies. And based on that, you can also divide the support dimension into non-supportive, like these, the red ones, and the supportive. And you have from before the influence divided into critical and marginal. And then you get some stakeholders who are supportive and have critical influence. This is the so-called the key stakeholders. They are willing to go the extra mile for your work, and their concern is, or their influence or their power is critical. These are the ones you want to really build your project on. And then there are people who are supportive already, but they have marginal influence. Of course, they want you, they like you, but they don't really have much to say at the end of the day. What you do, you maintain that support. It's important for you that they don't shift side. And then you have these non-supportive, but they have great influence. You can start thinking, some of you been working on projects perhaps, or even at school, at the university. They are not supportive to your work, not neutral, no, but they are not supportive. They are even willing to sabotage your work if it's possible. But they have great influence. What do you do with this type of group? Well, you have to reduce the dependency on these people. Best example, if the authorities want to build a road somewhere, and in order to build a road, you need to acquire land to build the road. And sometimes the landowners, they wouldn't do that. They wouldn't. They would rather keep the land, or they would resist that. In Norway, for instance, there are regulations that if the government or the authorities need to build something for the common benefit of the society, they have the power to put their hands on this land, and of course to compensate the project owner. So this law in itself is a way to reduce your dependency on non-supportive stakeholders. If you have a non-supportive stakeholders, then you try to, take them out of your project. You have a supplier that you're really much dependent, but at the same time, this type of supplier doesn't really care too much about your project. Get another one if you are able to do that, of course. And then you have these marginal stakeholders, and the main strategy here is to observe, or keep them under your eye. And this concludes our lecture for today. Thank you.